The US and India are seeking closer ties to counter China, and the sky isn't the limit. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The US and India don't see eye to eye on everything, especially when it comes to Russia, but nonetheless, the two nations are drawing closer to each other. And there's a simple reason why. Because that's what brings people together. Not what you both love, but what you both hate. If a complete stranger mentions the Flash movie was a convoluted mess, they're my new best friend, and we're going to chat about it for hours. Last week, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the White House. The U.S. and India commemorated recent moves to increase cooperation. For example, earlier this year, they started the initiative on critical and emerging technology to support working together on developing technology. Building on that, they also initiated the India-U.S. Strategic Trade Dialogue and the Roadmap for U.S.-India Defense Industrial Cooperation, which between the three of them could drown a small child in semi-meaningless bureaucratic jargon. Altogether, the agreements are supposed to facilitate the development and trade of technologies in critical domains such as semiconductors, space telecom, quantum, AI, defense, biotech, and others, and fast-track technology cooperation and co-production in areas such as air combat and land mobility systems, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, munitions, and the undersea domain. See what I mean about the bureaucratic jargon? Still, that's a lot of stuff to cooperate on. Luckily, if at any point they disagree, they can just remember what brought them together in the first place. The Beatles were wrong. Forget love, all you need is mutual hate. The U.S. benefits from this partnership because these deals help the U.S. to stop relying on China for so many things. India, meanwhile, benefits from gaining access to U.S. technology that it could only dream of having otherwise. It needs this kind of tech to catch up to China, mainly because China's been stealing it from us for decades. Already we're seeing some progress. Micron Technology, one of the world's largest chip firms, confirmed that it would invest up to $825 million in a $2.75 billion chip assembly and test facility in India. As for the defense side of things, the US and India agreed to jointly manufacture the General Electric jet engines needed to power modern jet fighters in India. This is a huge game changer for Indian defense. It's kind of like how in some Zelda games you go from a wooden sword to a bronze sword, and finally you get to the Master Sword. Well, imagine if instead of going through all that, you get to level up straight to a freaking fighter jet. Ganon doesn't stand a chance. The reason it's such a big deal is that only 4 countries in the world have the manufacturing technology and infrastructure needed to make high-end fighter jet engines. The US, the UK, France, and Russia. That's right, not China. And among those 4 countries, the U.S. fighter jet engines are the best of the best, at least according to the Heritage Foundation. Given how few countries can make high-end fighter jet engines, the manufacturing technology to do so is so closely guarded and only shared, even partially, with the closest of allies, which now includes India. The engines they're talking about building together has the same technology that powers the U.S. Navy's Super Hornet. High-end, but not bleeding edge. Still, it drastically improves India's capabilities in both the Indian Ocean and the Himalayas, and it could pave the way for construction of future U.S. aircraft. And speaking of the Himalayas, the U.S. also agreed to provide around 30 General Atomics MQ-9B high-altitude drones. It'll be a mix of Sea Guardians and Sky Guardians that will help India track Chinese troops in the Himalayas. In return, the U.S. gained access to Indian shipyards, where it can repair Navy ships. This would help the U.S. a ton in the event of war with China. Since so many of the U.S.'s ships are so old and worn down, you'd be safer riding on something designed by OceanGate. The CCP does not like the agreements, which is why Chinese state-run media warned India that it must reject U.S. plans of containing China. Obviously, India didn't listen, and when China gets angry, you know something's right. Both the U.S. and India signed a bunch more deals to improve cooperation. But one of the more surprising deals was India's agreement to join the Artemis Accords, an American-led effort to go back to the moon and explore Mars. I guess America doesn't need to worry about India abusing human rights in space, just alien rights. That's important. I'll tell you why after this quick commercial break. Welcome back. The US and India signed a whole bunch of deals, some of them greatly boosting India's Air Force capabilities. Some would say the sky's the limit, but Modi says not even. India agreed to sign the Artemis Accords to join 26 other nations in a US-led effort to explore the moon. According to a research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, it's a very big deal, as it is a general departure from the way India managed international space treaties and negotiations. India usually prefers legally binding treaties to govern both civilian and military space activities, but the Artemis Accords isn't legally binding. Or even a treaty, it's more like a set of principles by NASA that countries can follow for exploring the moon. It's the US's way of allowing resource extraction and safety zones while getting around the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which states that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claims of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means, which has upset the Chinese Communist Party to no end. What do you mean we can't claim Mars? It's literally a red planet. India definitely doesn't want to be left behind in the space race with the US and China. And this isn't just for prestige, although it is a lot of prestige. Getting a selfie on the moon is the ultimate clout on Instagram. India's national security depends on it, which is why India's space priorities are shifting accordingly. These days, space superiority has a huge role to play in geopolitics. China knows this, which is why it's pouring a lot of money and resources into developing its own space programs, such as the plan to land Chinese astronauts on the moon by 2030, which would be very useful for grabbing resources. Yes, China wants to mine the moon, which would be historic, as it would be the first time in history that slaves are sent to space. Unless you consider dogs human slaves. Aside from that, China's also developing new technology through experiments with biotech, high-energy beams, and even AI in space. Has China never seen any of the Alien movies? Or 2001: A Space Odyssey? AI in space never has a happy ending. China's already used a ground-based AI to control a small satellite for 24 hours without any human order, which is kind of redundant since communists aren't human anyway. But the AI satellite picked very specific spots to look at. One targeted area was Patna, an ancient city by the Ganges River in northeast India, which is also home to the Bihar Regiment, the Indian Army unit that met China's military in a deadly encounter in the Galwan Valley in the disputed border region in 2020. To counter China, India is building up its private sector to encourage SpaceX-type ventures, and is planning to launch its own space station by 2030. But India's space capabilities are very limited compared to China's. As of March 2020, China owned 13.6% of all Earth-orbiting satellites, compared to 2.3% for India. That's why it needs support from the US and other members of the Quad Alliance. So far, India's space research organization, ISRO, has joint projects to examine Earth's ecosystem with the US using a satellite, and to send a moon rover with Japan. Space collaboration between India and Australia is minimal, but with Australian investment tapping into India's space industry, something could come out of it. These collaborations could come in handy if something goes down with China on land or in space. Australia and India are also going to work together more. What I tell you, all you need is mutual hate. And this show would not exist without support from viewers like you. Join what I call the China Uncensored 50-cent army by contributing to the show on Patreon. You'll get a bunch of cool perks, including the ability to ask me questions I'll answer on the show. Today's question comes from Frank Kirka. Accidentally, are you joking? That was in response to this recent episode about China repeatedly performing dangerous maneuvers close to U.S. forces. There is no question about it. These close shaves with U.S. ships are no accident. Those are orders given from very high up within the Chinese Communist Party. But I said the risk is that China could accidentally spark a war if, during these close encounters, there's a crash and someone dies. I say accidentally because right now, the CCP is not ready for a military confrontation with the US. Behind the scenes, unrestricted warfare is already getting the CCP what it wants, but China is not ready for an actual fight. which is why it's rapidly building up its military. China already has a bigger navy than the US. So someday, a military conflict might really happen, and that will be no accident. Thanks for your question and your support, Frank, and thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.